Good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's joining us here in person in Washington, D.C., and to all of the folks who are joining us online. My name is Shireen Arthur White. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Children's Rights, and I'm also your moderator for today's briefing. We're going to do some quick intros of the panelists, and then we'll get going, starting with Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine Wally. I'm a social worker. I got into this work after being a mandated reporter and working as a mental health counselor with foster youth. And currently, I help to write and implement the mandated supporting framework and curriculum at a number of social work schools across the country. I've trained over 2,000 mandated reporters, and I'm currently on a research team examining mandated reporting in schools in Massachusetts.
Good afternoon. My name is David Kelly, and I am the co-founder of the Family Justice Group. I'll move this closer. How about now? Okay. My name is David Kelly. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the Family Justice Group. We're a small organization that seeks to prevent family separation, and our main focus is working with communities to develop new approaches that ensure that families, especially parents and young people, get what they need.
And my name is Joyce McMillan. I am the founder and executive director of Just Making a Change for Families, better known as JMACforFamilies. I am also the founder of PLAN, Parent Legislative Action Network, and I am a parent who was impacted by this system.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angela Burton. I'm a lawyer by training. Over my 30-year career in the law, I've served as a law professor at numerous schools. I've worked in state government and on a variety of issues around constitutional family law, children's rights, with a particular focus on the child welfare, child protective services, family policing regulation system. I am also the co-convenor, along with JMACforFamilies and her brilliant team, of a national coalition called Repeal CAPTA. We are a coalition of impacted families, along with other professionals such as doctors, lawyers, social workers, teachers, and others who are looking to understand the impact of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, which we're going to be discussing today. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of our panelists. So we're gonna get this discussion started today and set the tone on this discussion that's focused on the child welfare or family policing system and federal spending. We're gonna start with a very short video from the 21st National Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect, and it's titled, "What If?" All right, thanks for tuning in. Thanks to our tech folks today for getting us up and running. So David, you shared this video with us, and we're going to zero in today on talking about federal funding and how to shift federal funding to ensure that we're actually keeping kids safe, supporting children, and supporting families. So what is it about this video that made you want to share it with everybody here today?
Thanks, Shireen. Well, it's a message of urgency and of hope. And today, right now, I think with good reason for both. The urgency that this film speaks to is about the harm that's caused by unnecessary family separation, the trauma it causes. But the film also leaves us on a hopeful note, because we know more than ever right now about what it takes to keep families together and to keep children safe. This film was put together about 4 years ago, as Shireen mentioned, as part of the National Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect. It was intended to be a call to action around the need to focus on community-based support to help make sure that parents have access to those things that they need and that they want to try to help achieve well-being, maintain well-being. I think we have a tremendous opportunity right now, especially with all that we learned about the importance of family support, parent support during the pandemic, to realign funding and policy to make sure that critical supports are in place where people need them, the way that they want them, in their own communities. And that supporting parents, supporting families is the best way to keep children safe.
Thanks for that, David. And just thanks for setting the tone for opening our minds up to imagine something different, something that looks differently than what we have right now. Next year, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or CAPTA, will be 50 years old, and we are long overdue to examine the true impact that this piece of legislation has had on children and families, and also the funding choices that come along with the enactment of CAPTA back in 1974, funding choices that still carry us through to today. So CAPTA is the federal law that sets the parameters of state intervention into families. CAPTA lays out very broad definitions of both abuse and neglect, and both terms are more specifically defined by each state under state law. At the end of 2021, which is the most recent data that we have, there were 391,098 children in the foster system. 63% of those children were separated from their parents for reasons of neglect, as defined under federal and state law. 36% were separated due to substance use. 10% were separated from their families due to inadequate housing. 7% of children were separated from their families due to child behavior problems. 12% of children were separated due to physical abuse, and 4% were separated due to sexual abuse. And I hope it goes without saying that these determinations are extremely subjective, and they're susceptible to conscious and unconscious bias. Black children are disproportionately enduring family separation here in the US at the hands of the child welfare or family policing system, as they make up 14% of the general population here in the US and 24% of the child welfare population. So Joyce, I'm gonna turn to you for a moment. You work with families, you're active in your own community, and you've been working with people around the country. You've heard this data point of 63% of children being separated from their families due to neglect. Can you tell us what kind of situations make up this 63%? What are families experiencing, and what are we talking about when we're talking about neglect?
What we're talking about when we speak about neglect is something that could be fixed with financial stability of the family. So we spend a lot of money on investigations and interrogations of the family to gather information, but not to provide any support once we figure out what the gap or the lack is. So what I see happening is families being separated for things that we could step in and support for, that does not need to rise to the level of separation. These are not cases where a child is being abused. These are cases clearly where the family is lacking something. So it may be that a landlord refuses to fix something in the apartment that Child Protection Services, as they call themselves, would say is a danger to the child. It could be that the house is a small apartment and a lot of people live there, so it's a little crowded, and they say the house is dirty when it's cluttered, and not cluttered to the point of a safety issue. It could be that the family is living in a shelter where everyone is a mandated reporter and seeking to scrutinize the family from every angle and seeing that they're imperfect in some way and reporting them. It could be a child continuously late to school or missing school because the child gets a bus or a train pass, but the parent does not. So if they're taking public transportation and the mom does not have the money to travel, she cannot put the child on the public transportation by themselves. I actually had a case like that where the mom was pregnant, very ill, unable to take the child to school, was warned. When the child missed school again, the child was removed. Mom became so stressed out that she gave birth to the child she was carrying early. And although she was concerned that she was giving birth early, she was happy thinking that would resolve the issue and she would be able to get her son back. But what happened is they took the baby at birth on a derivative. And so this was something that could have been resolved by just having someone step in. And that's what neglect cases are, cases where we can support the family and save the state and the taxpayers a lot of money.
Thank you, Joyce. We want to talk a little bit about how those families and those cases are coming to the attention of child welfare systems to begin with. So a lot of folks might be familiar that CAPTA includes provisions and definitions for abuse and neglect. And folks are familiar or have heard about mandated reporting, but I don't know that a lot of folks realize that it's CAPTA that includes this requirement to report. So within CAPTA, in order for states to receive federal funding, they must have provisions or procedures for certain individuals to report abuse of or neglect. So Angela, I'm going to turn to you. Can you talk to us a little bit about CAPTA and its requirement for mandated reporting, but also just back us up a little bit and tell us sort of how we got here?
Sure. Thank you, Shireen. I think it's really important for us to understand sort of, at least on a general basis, the history of CAPTA, so that we have a context for what it is that's happening now and why people like us and many others are saying that it's time to, after 50 years, to really reevaluate what this statute has done and whether or not we need to look at things a little differently. The one thing that I want to start with, as kind of pointed out earlier and also with the video, we have a system where our understanding is that it's a child welfare system, that it's a child protection system, and that the goals of the system are to promote children's safety, stability, and well-being. Those are the three goals that the government says that the system is meant to accomplish. However, the experience as well as the well-documented evidence indicates that that is absolutely not what is happening within this system. And in fact, the reason why that's not happening is because the system isn't designed to support safety, stability, and well-being. The system, as it is structured in CAPTA, is designed as a system of surveillance, investigation, prosecution, and what's called treatment, which funnels people into the services industry. So reporting is one of the 4 pillars of CAPTA, right? Reporting, mandated reporting, which requires certain professionals, and in some states, everyone is mandated to report any reasonable suspicion that a child might be abused and neglected. And as Shireen pointed out, that definition is very porous and it's not consistent or uniform across the country, and very subjective. And so mandated reporting really is the sort of the 911 of the child protective services system. One of the issues with where mandated reporting is situated is that it comes out of an ideology or a mindset that was pretty much started with Dr. Henry Kemp, who championed that physicians specifically back in the early 60s should be required to report to authorities situations where parents brought children into the hospital with really serious, egregious physical injuries, right? And that were not explainable as accidental, but were suspicious. And so the mandated reporting portion of CAPTA comes out of a mindset that parents are to be, are suspicious characters, right? But also that it's a criminal act, right? And so again, additionally to being a criminal act, because Dr. Kemp was also a psychiatrist, that parents who were labeled as child abusers were also labeled as psychologically deviant or mentally ill, right? And so now we have this system of reporting that's based on a concept of criminalization and pathology. And so I want to read a quote by Senator Walter Mondale, who was the sponsor of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. And he was very concerned about this requirement that professionals be mandated to report suspicions of child abuse and neglect. And he wrote back in 1975, as the author of CAPTA, I would like to make it clear that the intention of that act was to address the problems of the most severely threatened and abused children in our country. It was clear from the time the Senate first considered this legislation that the resources it could provide would not be adequate to deal effectively with the much more complicated and difficult problem of child neglect. Mondale expressed concern about mandated reporting of suspected cases of child neglect by a wide range of individuals. And he was also concerned that wide variations across disciplines about the meaning of neglect, right? And how suspected cases would be treated. Because abuse and neglect were conflated in CAPTA to mean one thing or to mean many things, right? Mondale considered that it would lead to an unwarranted intrusion of the government into family life. And he emphasized that we must do all we can to safeguard families, particularly those who are poor and from minority groups, from being enveloped in a system which may label them permanently as criminals or deviants, and which may lack the resources to provide services even if they are legitimately required. So this quote, I think, really kind of encapsulates all of what we've talked about so far, that the system itself is says it does one thing, but it actually is designed to do something completely different. And that's where we see the misalignment in the outcomes and the experiences of children.
Thanks for taking us sort of down that historical lane, Angela. But also, I think what we're seeing today are the very things that Senator Mondale was cautioning us against. And we see that show up in the form of over-reporting. He was cautious about mandated reporting for situations of neglect and having all kinds of people make determinations on what that looks like for families. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the harms of the over-reporting and that he was reflecting on in those statements made back in the 70s?
Right, yeah. And just as a note, we have a one-pager which kind of, lays out a lot of the statistics about the over-reporting and the inaccuracies in that reporting. And so what we see is that there are, 4 million reports, every year, and that the majority of these reports are screened out because they don't even rise to the level of this very subjective definitions. The ones that are screened in and lead to the types of investigations that Joyce talked about are not even, substantiated at a very high level. I think it was 17% actually kind of come to the conclusion that there was something to be concerned about that would arise to the level of government intervention into the constitutionally protected relationship between the parent and the child. One of the main concerns with regard to the reason we're here today to talk about is the overburdening of the system with these, reports that really
This app not only has
the overburdening of the system with these reports that draw resources and energy and attention and money from those cases where children really are in need of some assistance from outside of the family. And of course, what we're proposing is that assistance should come from the community and not this sort of intrusive government intervention, but the broad and porous definitions, the overbroad number of categories of people who are required to report are really overburdening the system and really pulling resources away from not only community supports, but also from those who are in the system charged with actually detecting, identifying, and responding to the egregious types of harms that the Mondale said that the system was supposed to be addressing.
Thanks for that, Angela. And just a note, I think we're getting some feedback on the Zoom. So as the panelists are speaking, we'll draw back from the mic a little bit. You don't need it to be so closely to us. But Joyce, the data is one thing, and we have reports, but you work with families, and I think you have a real understanding of what people experience with mandated reporting. Can you talk about what some of those experiences are like? What is the actual impact to children and families from this policy?
Fear, the inability to ask for help when you need it, because families know that they need some supports, but it prevents them from asking because everyone they would ask is mandated to report them. And it kind of doesn't make sense because now we have to rely on someone scrutinizing the family so closely that they can figure out that the family's lacking something, instead of just having the family have the ability to come and say, I'm struggling with X, Y, or Z. So it does the exact opposite of what they say it's intended to do. In addition to that, a lot of mandated reporters weaponize CPS against families the same way that other people weaponize it because they want to control the family. Many of the reports that I had came from the school system. My children went to a school, I don't know if it's unfortunately or fortunately, that was all white. And one of my daughters was one of 3 Black children in the classroom. So no matter what she did, there was an issue. And if I defended or supported her in any way, that was a call to CPS because then I was not listening. So how can they control her if they can't control me when it was never an issue of control, it was a preference. And so I think mandated reporting has caused immense harm. Children fear knocks on the door when their parents are being investigated, and children fear being removed from their home, separated from their siblings. Remember, some children who are being investigated are being reinvestigated. So they may have been separated from their family in the past, and they understand what that means. That means I don't just lose my mom and my dad, I lose my siblings. In some cases, even their twins. I lose my grandparents, my entire support system. I change schools every couple of months. I change friends. I change who my quote unquote siblings are. Every part of me is impacted. What I see, what I hear, what I taste, all 5 senses are touched each time you change homes. So having someone scrutinize a family and report them for something that they only suspect is dangerous, that a allegation can lead to a separation. Because remember, most families are separated before any allegation is ever substantiated.
Thanks for that, Joyce. And that's important because a lot of folks think, well, we'll just make the report and somebody will check it out. But there is trauma that can be inherent to that investigation in and of itself. Do you want to? Yeah.
And I would like to add something. Even mandated reporters know that they're not helping the family. They'll tell you, oh, I did it to get them help. I knew they needed something. But the fact of the matter is when they report in secret, and they pray to God that the family that they report on never finds out that they were the one who reported. And that's because they know it's not helpful. And everything they say in this system is contrary to what they say. What happens is contrary to what they say.
Yeah, and I want to ask Jasmine to jump in on that a little bit, because you're a social worker, you work with social workers, you work with other mandated reporters, and we'd love your insight on how mandated reporters themselves are experiencing this policy.
Thank you. And, you know, I want to say I'm thankful for the Social Work Caucus for putting this briefing on, because really the social work profession is at an inflection point. And a lot of it is being driven by a new generation of social workers who are able to see that mandated reporting has historically harmed families and continues to harm families. And when you look at the history of the social work profession, the younger generation is always pushing the profession towards its ethical obligations towards families, which is to support families, which is to meet what families need and divest away from pushing families into more systems that tend to hurt them. And so with that, you know, as I said earlier in my introduction, I helped to write the mandated supporting curriculum that's now being used across the country in social work schools. You know, consulted for social work schools that are looking to shift their training, the way that they train social workers, the way that they talk about this system, the way that they talk about their ethical obligations. And over again, what I hear is that, and you know, this is even echoed by city commissioners, city CPS commissioners, that whatever we do to change this practice will always be limited under the law, right? Everything that we can change to a mandated supporting framework, but we're still bound within these legal guidelines defined by CAPTA. And, you know, as Shireen mentioned, I work with social workers. I help to run a group that meets every month to talk about how we could be mandated supporters. You know, how do we support families instead of reporting them to this system? And over again, what I hear is that there's this limit on our professional discretion, right? We are limited by the law, and we are told by our supervisors and told by our agencies that, you know, we must make a report, that our professional discretion or our obligation to this family or our relationship to this family doesn't matter, because this law and this liability is what comes first. You know, I'm thinking of one social worker who talked about how she would cut off a client if the client, started to veer into a story or a situation that might rise to the level of a mandated report, which is really a disservice to this client, right? If this client and this social worker can't work together on what this client might be experiencing in the home because family separation might be the result, that is really hurting the children, right? That is really hurting this relationship, that is hurting this child, that is hurting this family. And so when we have these blanket policies that require all social workers to report everything that rises to this level, we're really, not holding this nuance of relationship building. We're not holding the importance of relationship building. And clients are fearful to talk to their therapist or to talk to their social worker. Once a report is made, that therapeutic relationship is largely over, right? I've heard that. I was in a training in North Carolina, training mandated reporters, and one person came up to me. She was a young woman. She said, this last month is the first time I went back to therapy after years, because she had experienced a mandated report as a young person, in her youth. And she was so traumatized by the idea of going to therapy that she refused to go until she was older and family separation wasn't a threat, right? So we're pushing people out of therapy. And as a social work caucus, that is really away from what our profession wants, right? We support people seeking therapy if they want, but people who are marginalized are being particularly targeted by this practice and being pushed away from any sort of support. And the final point I'll make, actually 2 more points. Therapists and social workers, this is peer-reviewed research that therapists and social workers experience burnout, they experience moral injury as a result of these policies. So, when we're particularly looking at survivors of domestic violence who are working in domestic violence spaces and agencies, who really care deeply about this work, who are really trained and experienced and qualified to work with other survivors, the level of moral injury from being told they have to report a survivor and push them into this system, forces people out of their profession. It forces people that we need and we want in these professions out, which really is a disservice to children. It's really a disservice to families. And there's this one study that says, navigating the tension exacts emotional toll, causes irreparable damage to their advocacy relationships, and harms survivors, right? So we are harming people that we are supposed to be helping. And my final point, I promise the last point, the White House plan to end gender-based violence, one of their recommendations is actually to research the impacts of mandated reporting on children and survivors. So this isn't the first time that the federal government is talking about mandated reporting. This is, highlighted in, by the White House Gender Policy Council. So I think we're, as I said, at an inflection point in this profession, but also as this country. What can we do to change this law so that our profession isn't just, replicating the same things that we've done for the past 50 years.
Thanks so much for that, Jasmine. We want to talk about what we can do. So we've talked about how families are entangled with this system because they don't have necessities of life, because they don't have resources. We've talked about how, because of policies like mandated reporting, families are not getting the help that they need. And we should be talking about how to ensure that federal funding is shifted so that families are being helped, so that families can stay together. Not just the funding, but also policies and practice. So I'm going to turn it over to Jasmine, Joyce, and Angela. A question for all of you, if each of you want to weigh in. What do we do about mandated reporting?
Well, I'll start and add a little bit of context as well. And so, as I said before, mandated reporting and the reporting scheme itself in terms of the surveillance and all of the consequences that flow from that, is really the front end of the system, right? And it starts to funnel people into a whirlwind or a whirlpool of responses to primarily poverty-related conditions that ends up making the family worse off than when the government intervened. And so when we're talking about mandated reporting and what to do about mandated reporting, one of the things is that we should just end mandated reporting. We should eliminate the mandate or the requirement that states have a system of mandated reporting in order to receive federal funding. That in and of itself will, as Jasmine and others talked about, help to start returning a right balance or a right relationship between the helping professionals and the communities that they're meant to help. They will be able to exercise their own independent judgment about what sort of help they can provide to the family, to the children that they're interacting with an understanding, as we're all coming to realize more and more, that funneling them into a system that leads to investigation, right, and strip searching of children and the invasion of the family home, to prosecution, again, a requirement of CAPTA, that we're prosecuting poverty. We're taking families through an entire court process that can last years, right? Because of something that we could easily have responded to with supports, or even simply leaving the family alone. Then, with the prosecution part comes, referrals to treatment, right? Again, going back to Kemp's formal, framing of parents as having mental or psychological defects. There's a whole industry of services around psychological testing and prevention services and all these sorts of, and parenting classes and anger management classes and all these sorts of things. So ending mandated reporting can help to stem the tide of families being drawn through the system. And I love quotes because I always think that other people can say things much more eloquently than I can. But recently, the Administration for Children and Families, which oversees the Children's Bureau, which is the main implementer of our child welfare system, wrote in a, what do they call it? A NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, June 1st, dated June 1st. And this Notice of Funding Opportunity is entitled Field Initiated Approach to Addressing Racial Bias and Inequity in Child Welfare. And in that funding opportunity, the Administration for Children and Families wrote and acknowledged that CAPTA's structure is responsible, quote, for many structural barriers and racial biases that have contributed to family dysfunction, separation, and destruction under the guise of safety and well-being. ACF also recognized that families entangled in the system are often embarking on a seemingly continuous journey of surveillance, interruption, removal, and for many, eventual breakdown, leading to lasting adverse outcomes impacting generations. ACF also said that to address these state-inflicted multi-generational threats to children and families, that's my framing, I said that. ACF proposes, quote, to move strategically towards eliminating the existing structures that harm and work to further support families and care for children by strengthening and expanding community-based efforts that already exist and launching new initiatives. So the federal government, right, that oversees the system recognizes that the structures, including mandated reporting and specifically mandated reporting, is leading to harm to children and that we should eliminate it.
And you want to answer? Anything else about mandated reporting?
Yeah, I would like for people to think of mandated reporting the same way that we thought of stopping and frisking people. It is the stop and frisk of the family regulation system. It is people who suspect people who live in certain zip codes, who dress a certain way, whose hair is combed a certain way, whose skin color is of a certain color. These are the people who we are stopping and frisking. These are the people whose children will, 1 in every 2, be impacted by this system in ways that are unimaginable. We all see the outcomes. We all see that children who enter this system or who are forced into the system do poor. We all know it. We quote the numbers to what's happening, the likelihood of them going to prison, the likelihood of them graduating high school, the likelihood of being a teenage parent and having their own child in the system, the likelihood of being drug addicted, the likelihood of developing a mental illness, but yet we surveil families to find children to put them into that system where the only thing they protect children from is success. It's a no-brainer. Get rid of it.
I just want to highlight that one of the statistics that Joyce pointed out, that 53% of Black children experience a child welfare or a child protective service investigation. We can't train our way out of this. The federal government has, for I think the past decade and a half, put out guidances on ways to better train mandated reporters. But we can't train our way out of racism. We can't train our way out of implicit biases or implicit class biases. The step that we need to take is to eliminate mandated reporting.
Yeah, and we also can't turn our backs to the notion that the system itself is traumatic and harmful and dangerous and producing really bad outcomes for kids. So thank you to all of you for that answer. I want to talk a little bit about the funding. David, I'm going to turn to you to talk to us a little bit, as high level as you can, about the funding that's attached to the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act and some recommendations around how we can shift that funding around a bit.
Thank you. So, very high level here. CAPTA funds kind of 3 categories of activity, I would say. The first falls in the investigation, prosecution realm. And that's largely wrapped up in what's called the state grant portion of CAPTA. The second portion of CAPTA focuses in on community-based child abuse prevention grants. It's called CBCAP. And this is actually, in my view, the single most helpful part of CAPTA. We've heard quite a bit about the problematic areas and the harm that over-reporting and misuse of hotlines cause. Child abuse hotlines should be for emergency situations only, when a child has been harmed or is at imminent risk of harm. And what we hear, all of us in our different capacities around the country, is that mandated reporters often call because they're worried about liability and not necessarily worried about actually abuse or neglect. Or they view that a call to a hotline is akin to a call for help. But the sad reality is help doesn't come from a hotline call. An investigation comes from a hotline call. And then if someone is substantiated, there is child welfare intervention. If they're not, even if they might need some type of support, they're not really going to get it. So the second part of CAPTA, the CBCAP grants, community-based child abuse prevention grants, are designed actually to be that source of support that will be present in communities in culturally responsive ways to support programming and supports and resources and opportunities by and for people that live in those communities in non-stigmatic ways. And that's just a crucial piece to supporting families and promoting overall well-being. There's a second part to CAPTA that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's called the Adoption Opportunities Program. And that's really incongruent with the rest of what's in there. But as everyone has pointed out, I think just so articulately, this is a prime opportunity to re-examine CAPTA. It was, enacted in the 70s. I'd like to think we've learned quite a bit since then, although some days I really wonder. But we can realign the resources of the CAPTA to support those things that we know truly help families. And as Jasmine has said, divest or shift funding away from those things that resemble or include investigation, prosecution. There are other sources of funding for that. But this is one of the only federal sources of funding that actually can go to help support community-based resources and opportunities. And I just want to share really briefly, if there's time, one of the strongest examples of what CBCAP makes possible. And there's an effort in Nebraska that I was very familiar with when I worked for the Children's Bureau and have become more familiar with even since. And in Nebraska, the CBCAP lead agency, that's the organization that the grant dollars go to, is a non-government organization. The one really strong part of CAPTA is that the governor of any state can determine the lead agency or the lead entity. And it's best when that entity is not the child welfare agency, but it is a community group or even some other government agency that does not have the authority to remove children. In this instance, the lead agency is a foundation called the Nebraska Children and Families Foundation. And what they've done is partner with counties across the state to bring together community members and other stakeholders to design what they're calling is a community response and a community collaboration. So the work there really begins by listening and hearing directly from parents, from community members about what's going on in their lives, what they would find most helpful, what they want for their children. And these grant dollars are then used creatively to design programs, approaches, opportunities in those communities to specifically meet what parents are saying would be helpful, would enrich their families and promote well-being and all of those things. Likewise, the community response component, really is a different option, an alternative to calling a child abuse and neglect hotline that mandated reporters or anyone can consider using when a family needs some type of support or the family itself wants some type of support, but there are not concerns about physical or sexual abuse. It's simply a family in need. Most commonly, a family that's economically fragile, low income, or wrestling with some condition of poverty. And the community response is a trusted, it varies from community to community, but a trusted entity, organization that can receive such calls and then plug that family into whatever it is they may need or want. Nebraska is a more conservative state, and they're doing something that's very creative. It's having profound impacts on helping families feel supported. And it's now in at least 22 of their counties, and sometimes it's regionally based. But this whole notion that a key strategy to preventing family separation is making sure that families have access to resources and supports, it has got to be an enhanced feature of any reauthorization attempt or any new configuration of CAPTA. In my view, it should be the primary focus of CAPTA and where most of the CAPTA dollars are invested. CAPTA itself is not a whole lot of money. So, I would argue strongly that limited amount of money should be invested in what has potential to make the most impact. And that is CB-CAP.
Thanks, David. Because if it wasn't clear enough, the way that the money is currently structured, we spend far more money on the investigation side, the reporting side, the caseworker side, the workforce side to get these really scary, harmful, traumatic results that we've talked about, and far fewer dollars in that CB-CAP portion that David just mentioned. And we think that should be reversed. So there's another pot of federal dollars outside of CAPTA that I think we want to bring up today, mostly because we've seen it in the news more recently in the ways that states are abusing those funds, and that's TANF funds, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, TANF. So I want Jasmine to sort of just weigh in a little bit about TANF funds, what are those monies for, and how that's showing up in the news lately.
Sure. So Joyce, laid out for us the ways that poverty, sorry, I'm close to the mic, the ways that poverty leads and symptoms of poverty lead to an investigation, which are then, impacted by implicit biases and, symptoms of poverty further this case along towards family separation, right? And when we think about the most basic prevention program that we can think of, support for the family, unrelated to the child welfare system, is the most effective way of preventing touching the system, the most effective way of preventing family separation, and the most effective way of supporting children and families. And right now, TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which was passed to support families with direct cash assistance. There is so much vagueness within the way that this policy is implemented, but state by state, that much of TANF funding actually gets used for child welfare services, which includes child welfare investigations, which includes child welfare separations for this system. Nationwide, only 23% of TANF funding is spent on basic assistance, and nationwide, 9% is spent on the child welfare system. But when we look at, state by state, in Mississippi, only 6% of TANF funding is spent on basic assistance. That means cash assistance, right? 6% of their pot of money is spent on cash assistance, which is what families need. And 27% is spent on the child welfare system. So more than a quarter of Mississippi's TANF funds is not spent on what families need. It is spent on investigating families and separating families. In Missouri, 6% of TANF funding is spent on basic assistance, and 32% is spent on child welfare, right? So there's this huge range of how we're spending TANF dollars because there is no federal guidance on how this money can be spent. And so one simple solution is to develop federal guidelines on the usage of TANF funding to restrict the percentage of spending on child welfare. And that's very much in line with this group's mission, of using these federal dollars as the quote unquote primary prevention that, effectively promotes child well-being and keeps families together. And one last thing I'll highlight, there's so much research, 30 peer-reviewed articles in the past year. That's an exaggeration, but there's at least 6, right? Pointing to how direct cash assistance, the child tax credit, unregulated funding for parents decreases the reports of child maltreatment, right? So giving parents money and giving families money that's not attached to participating in a service or not attached to having a child welfare investigation first is effective at preventing reports of child maltreatment.
Shireen, before you move on, I just wanted to add to what Jasmine said about these reports and studies. Congress commissioned the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to do research into how do we reduce child poverty by 50%. And the NAS issued a report in 2019 and basically said exactly what Jasmine said, right? That supporting families with concrete material resources and providing families and children with the resources and opportunities that they need in order to provide for themselves is the way to reduce child poverty. Additionally, I think it was last year, Casey Family Programs took that report and ran it through a whole bunch of statistical regression things that I don't really quite understand, and basically said that if we do some combination of those recommendations from the NAS report, that investigations of, so they looked at it in terms of how would that impact children and families interacting with the child welfare system, with the family policing system. And they said that enacting some different packages of those recommendations would significantly reduce investigations by CPS and would also impact the racial disproportionality or the racial targeting of Black children as well by the system. So Congress, you have already been given the information that you need in order to move forward. And our recommendation with regard to what David said of moving money into CB-CAP, right, fits well within those recommendations by those two entities. And I want to just really, really emphasize that moving money and giving families money alone will not address the harms of CAPTA. We also have to, as ACF and others in the federal government have acknowledged, we also have to eliminate the harmful practices such as mandated reporting and these investigations and prosecutions as well at the same time. Otherwise, we're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem.
Thanks, Jasmine and Angela. One of the things that's coming up for me is when we were talking about what families experience, what they endure once that report is made and these investigations commence. And at Children's Rights, we published a call to action report back in May 2021 that really focused on racism at the front end of the child welfare system, but we examined, at what advocacy was looking like around the country. And something that came up was what would happen if parents had attorneys at the outset, right? If they faced those investigations and were armed with legal representation and counsel from the beginning, if they knew what their rights were, if they understood what the process was that was going to happen, right? And what we wrote in that report was, it may be a way to stop the over removal of children. It may be a way to ensure that children's rights to family integrity were upheld. And so we have time for one more recommendation, and I'm thinking about the legal representation piece as families are subjected to reporting and investigations. Can you touch on any recommendations around that, Angela?
Yeah, sure. And so, as far as legal representation is concerned, we understand that on the road to eliminating these harmful impacts, that there are some ways that we can mitigate the overreach that we see that comes with government intervention into the parent-child relationship. which is a legally constitutionally protected relationship, right? And so going back to the structure of the system, we also understand that when CAPTA was enacted in 1974, it was enacted without any regard for that constitutional right of children and parents to their relationship bond and to the family unit in terms of family integrity and the ability of parents to make decisions for their children and for their families. And so there's been a movement over the past years to ensure that parents have legal representation. So the ABA, American Bar Association, issued a report last year. This is 2023, yes, in 2022, that basically said that the child welfare legal structure, the legal system, is one of the most complex systems of law in this country. Not tax law, not real estate law. I know child welfare law is one of the most complex, right? And so for parents to have to endure an interaction with an agency that's armed with all of the legal expertise, with all of the resources, with all of the power and authority that's delegated to them by these laws, such as CAPTA, is really a travesty of justice. And so in recent years, the federal government, through the Children's Bureau, has opened up some Title E funding to the states to allow it to be used for independent legal representation of parents. And I would, as an aside, indicate that agency attorneys who represent child welfare agencies, they have always been allowed, that Title E funding has always been allowed to support legal representation for the agency. So again, that imbalance, right, that we see. And so a recommendation to ensure that states are using that Title E 4E funding to ensure that parents have legal representation, and perhaps even a mandate that whenever CPS knocks at the door, that parents should be given government-funded legal representation, just as the agency has government-funded legal representation, particularly during the investigation stage, when rights are being intruded upon, I dare say trampled, with no checks and balances. And that's where we end up with things like hidden foster care, where children are actually separated from their families without any sort of judicial oversight. That's where we get to a point where after months and sometimes years of agency interaction with the family, they finally decide to take them to court. And at that point, in some states, parents are entitled to free legal representation. In some states, later on down the road, when the agency is asking for termination of parental rights, may be the first time that parents are entitled to free legal representation. And we know that the parents who are targeted, the families who are targeted, can't afford $300-400 an hour for an attorney. And so they're going to be eligible for free legal representation. And we want to encourage our representatives to do all they can to make sure that states are providing that representation at the earliest point of contact and throughout. And one more point, that must be quality, high quality legal representation. We have models of representation in these situations because, as we know, this is not just a social services system, it's also a legal system. And so the model that is currently sort of the gold standard is that there would be an attorney, a social worker, as well as a parent advocate, someone who's been through the system who can help navigate that process along with the parent as they go through that situation. So we are not just looking for a body, right? We want to make sure that those attorneys are well trained, that they're well paid, and that they have oversight and accountability to the parents that they represent.
And as a parent who has been impacted by this system, I also want my attorney to be an advocate, right? Because we didn't start asking for Miranda rights for families until parents began asking for it. So attorneys operated in this system for decades, knowing that child welfare officials or agents entered people's homes, collected information without having a court order, and no one ever questioned what that meant in relation to the Fourth Amendment rights given to us by the Constitution. And just so many different things that as attorneys working within the child welfare world, we're not looking at the parallel things that's happening in the criminal justice and seeing the safeguards that people who are being accosted by the police have. These are the family police, and we should have the same protections. So Angela and I attended a hearing for a young lady. New York City is comprised of 5 boroughs, and 4 of the 5 boroughs have the defender services that Angela was speaking about. This young lady was in Staten Island, and they do not have a defender service. And they terminated her rights without her having an attorney. And she begged for an attorney. And we attended more than one court hearing with her, where the judge told her to stop asking because she would not be given an attorney. And so now her rights are terminated. She's lost all her children, and there's no one to appeal because the attorneys who represent families in family court don't do appeals. So she would have to find an outside attorney to do that, and that would cost a lot of money. And so everything is just all wrong about this system, and it's so much more to talk about than the things that we spoke about today. However, the things that we spoke about today, I guess we, as a group, had decided to prioritize and share with you and other people because we need you on board. We need you to understand what is happening to families. They are decimating the Black community, especially. If children are our future, the Black community has no future because our children are being strip searched, taken from home, interrogated in schools, threatened, afraid. Parents are afraid. They are not their child's superhero anymore after CPS investigations because the child sees their weakness and how they were unable to protect them. And a system that was, quote unquote, built to protect children should not have the outcomes that it has. And it should not be violating people's rights the way that it does. And people should be informed and know what their rights are. I mean, people who work within this system doesn't even know what the rights of families are. So I just ask you guys to continue looking into this on your own accord and share the word because there's power in numbers. And I think the work that has been happening in New York that I've been working diligently on for the last 8 years is happening because people like David Kelly and Jasmine and Shireen and Angela has joined the fight with me, and even some of the advocates who are here in the office. So, you know, I ask that you guys join in too. There's plenty of ways you can get involved, and knowledge is power. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce. And just building off of what you said, there's also power in communities. And we started off this briefing with a video. So we're gonna close out with the video and then we can turn to Q&A. And we know we have a number of folks online, so thanks for hanging in with us as well.
We see that the parents need help with the kids. You know, we see that the neighbors, they're having a hard time feeding their kids. A thriving community sees what's going on and intervenes before it becomes a crisis.
they make sure I have everything what I need for like my kids and stuff. They ask me like, they just check up on me. They make sure that I'm doing fine, like I'm in the right stable mind, like, cause like, you gotta be mentally and physically ready.
When you have hope, you can do some stuff with some hope. You can move some mountains with some hope.
I think if the Department of Family Services played more role in helping the whole family, not just the children, I think that you will have more of a success story than something that just fell through the cracks.
We get to be a part of something really amazing. Again, it's more than just the work that we're doing. We're planting seeds of hope. We're planting seeds of joy.
All the blood, sweat, and tears, I'm gonna help somebody not go through as much as I have.
Do we have any questions? If you have a question and you want to step up to this mic, please feel free. You have to turn it on and just give it a second.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sarah, and I've been hiking across the country 936 miles, representing the children that have lost their lives to family court violence or a parent that has murdered them. So since 2008, you might know that 969 children have now been murdered by a parent or guardian when child support, child custody, visitation, separation was mentioned in news coverage. So I'm standing here today as the voice of those 969 murdered children. The children are asking for a clear plan to safety. So when violence is happening to them, they cannot escape a parent's abuse. They'll go through CPS. CPS will say, oh, you're in the family court system. And then the judge won't do anything because CPS doesn't find abuse. One thing that we now know that we didn't know when your act was created was that coercive control is actually a greater predictor of homicide to children than physical violence. These children need the definition of coercive control added to the definition of domestic violence and a clear plan to safety. So if there's having coercive control happen to them by a parent, they need a clear path to safety, one that's not, well, maybe you can get to safety, but one that ensures that. Adding attorneys to the mix can sometimes be concerning because the attorneys can be can add to the stress and coercion, and can sometimes the child loses the voice in that process of having attorney versus attorney. So I would just say, make sure there's research backed by that. That would be my concern. I think the children would say, where's my attorney? So, and we already know with the family court process that the current attorneys that are assigned to the children are not helping them. It's actually hurting them, and they're covering up the abuse, and they can't get to safety and escape. But I appreciate everything that you're doing. And I had one question here about it. Would you guys have any ability or authority to create any sort of safety or protection orders for children against parents? Is that anything that your funding could help support?
Thanks so much for that question. We sit with that all the time, right? And those questions of, well, there are kids who have died at the hands of their parents and who've died in their homes and are not safe there. And as I reflect on that, one of the things that comes up for me is that's under the current system that we have, right? That's why we're advocating for changes to the current system. And that is one example. There are many of the ways in which this system doesn't keep kids safe, right? And so that's one answer. I mean, in terms of your direct question, we don't have funding. We're here to talk about the ways in which federal dollars are used, but we don't have the funding to do any of that work, right? Does somebody else want to respond?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think that's in terms of thinking about the safety of children who are actually at risk or are being harmed, right? We have long experience with, as Shireen said, the system that we currently have not responding well to that. And I think that one of the things that we're promoting in asking for federal dollars and a shift in focus to community and family with support, right, is to allow communities, families, and those who have experienced that harm to identify what those plans of safety would be, right? It would not be for the system or people who are working in the system to create that alone. It would be for survivors who've been through it and who know what they would have wanted to happen, right? What they would have wanted to be available to them, and then to build out from there. So that's I think the impetus is to take these kinds of decisions and kinds of environments and resources out of the hands of bureaucrats who are sort of, removed, and really to be led by those people who are most impacted by the situations that we're envisioning as being responded to in a more humane, reparative, and restorative way.
I have just one brief thing to add, and that's that there was a national commission to eliminate child abuse and neglect fatalities that I think they issued a report in 2016. I think 2016 is when this report came out. There were a number of recommendations in there, but one of them in particular I really want to focus on because it's so important, so consistent with a lot of the focus of the conversation today. And one of the chief recommendations or findings was that family support and early intervention programming are a critical piece, one of the more important top 3 strategies, along with information sharing and better communication across agencies. But family support and early intervention programming and services was one of the key recommendations to not just preventing but eliminating fatalities. And I think that's a critical finding.
Thanks for weighing in, Angela. David, any other questions out there? Do you want to come to the mic?
Excuse my cat, but my hair's not.
Come as you are.
Good afternoon, I'm Mel Wallace-Pate. I'm a civil rights attorney for 46 years. I was the first attorney to file a lawsuit against the Child Protective Agency in 1982 for a child who was raped in foster care more than 200 times before her 4th birthday. At that time, foster children, we didn't know that foster children were being abused like that. So in California, which is where I did this, there was no law to rectify this. So I had to create a body of law. So I wrote over 40 statutes. And then I had to create a written body of law, which we call appeals decisions. So fast forward to 2024. I will say that at that first trial, one of the key witnesses was James Corman, who wrote the Adoption Assistance Act of 1980. Okay. That act was written in response to foster care drift because children were not going home. And there were no judicial determinations that foster care was necessary. And the money kept coming. So in order to prevent foster care drift, there was a joint bipartisan effort to require that all states submit a case plan that had to be approved by the secretary that would provide for a judicial determination in every case that removal of the child was necessary for the child's protection. In addition to that requirement, social workers have to provide a written report every 6 months that was necessary for continued protection to keep the child in foster care. I was an attorney in that courtroom in 1978. The law was changed in 1982. At that time, each state presented a case plan, a state plan for approval. Each one of those state plans had to include the recognition of due process. Due process is required before you can take a child and put a child in foster care. What I've heard today is wonderful efforts by all of you, but there's a missing thing. After CAPTA, you jump into Public Law 96-272. And then simultaneously with that 96-272, we have Title 4E. And Title 4E pays for foster care in the amount of $30 billion a year. I've been investigating the absence of the rule of law for 25 years. I've interviewed 10,000 parents and asked every one of them, did you ever cross-examine the social worker in court? And they all said no. Now they have a due process. Were you advised of your rights? No. I'm talking about a courtroom. I'm talking about the complete erasure of every single law that protects our children. We need to investigate why these attorneys are not representing these parents. There is no discretion. The law is very clear. Parents and children have due process rights. And what does that include? The first thing is they're advised of the charges against them. They're also advised that they have a right to an attorney. And if they can't afford it, the government has to give them one. That is not negotiable. I am so emotional about this. I have to apologize. I wasn't gonna talk at all. But I'm here to share with you the problem is in the courtroom. We must enforce Public Law 96-272, and I am calling for congressional hearings on compliance with these states that are getting $30 billion a year to do what? To railroad our children into the world's largest child sex trafficking operation.
You're right.
So let's get real and circle the wagons. I'm 82. And if I see another generation coming here with this same, you know what, I will have to live another 20 years. Because I will not stop talking until we recognize the rule of law, and no one is above the rule of law. And I call for congressional hearings on every state needs to be hauled in front of Congress. And I will say this. I'm African American. I come from a plantation in Woodville, Mississippi, called Bowling Green. And what I see now is modern slavery. It has to be addressed. It has to be addressed now. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much for raising that. And we also call for those same congressional hearings to not just haul in states, but to allow the opportunity to folks who've been impacted in very deep ways by this system to speak before Congress and to hear about the impact on the laws that we have in place and the federal policy and funding choices that exist. We took that work and this efforts and those recommendations to the United Nations, and they too have called on the US to hold those congressional hearings. And we now understand that the US, Congress has a committee called the Human Rights and the Law Committee, and they're looking into the foster system. We are hoping that they will watch the recording of this briefing, and that by the time CAPTA turns 50 in 2024, that those congressional hearings will have commenced. So thank you for your work and for your comment today. Any other questions, either on Zoom or in the room?
Can you guys speak to how the system is overburdened by mandated reporting and how we're missing the children that's actually being hurt?
Yeah, thank you for that. I know Angela mentioned a little bit, but David, Angela?
Well, I think it's a very serious problem that doesn't get enough attention. You know, on an annual basis, there are about 4 million reports. It's been previously mentioned that most of them are screened out. And I think what we really need to understand is the amount of energy, resources, time that goes into receiving all those reports and screening them out. And then the lack of follow-up or supports that are offered to families that might need something, but don't get them, get the services. And then finally, the odds of a child who is actually in imminent danger or has been harmed are reduced and may fall through the cracks when there's inappropriate reporting, over-reporting. You know, I think from the 4 million calls, I think only about 600,000 are substantiated, and then, you know, investigations follow, and an even smaller percentage of those are ultimately found to be abuse and neglect, mostly neglect. And so it's a real issue. We want to make sure that children who are in harm's way or have been harmed do receive the support that they need. And, you know, mandatory reporting, as we have discussed, is a big contributor to the volume of calls that come in. And I have met for several years now, in my former capacity as a federal employee and now in my current capacity, with mandatory reporters. And they want options. They want other options. They may want to try to connect a family just to some supports, but fear of loss of license, of criminal prosecution, of all of these other issues may lead them to report stuff that they know really doesn't need to be reported. And I've heard this time and time again from teachers, from medical professionals, from law enforcement officers that just don't know any other way to get help to families, and use the hotline in their state or jurisdiction as kind of a catch-all that extends far beyond emergencies.
Thank you, David. We're at time, folks. 5:02. We technically have this room till 5 o'clock.
Well, I won't take up time then, but thank you for being here. Remember, CAPTA's up for reauthorization. CAPTA makes up less than 1% of child protection funding in our federal government. It's a paltry amount of money to do what it needs to do, including being the only law that actually does provide legal representation, or representation not yet legal, to children and families. So as we all put together our efforts, CAPTA needs to be addressed. It needs to be funded to do what it should be doing better, and cut back where it's not doing what it's supposed to. And I just love this energy and hope that we can direct it towards getting where we need to go. So thank you, guys.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you all for attending. Yeah.